It's a great turnout this evening, so thank you for coming. And to no avail, I'll ask Sally to introduce herself. We'll probably run for about an hour, and then we'll have a few questions, if that's okay. If you wanted to finish a bit earlier, and we'll try and finish around 7:45, so you can go out and there will be some food. Okay? Is that everyone clear? Any questions? Okay, Sally, over to you.
Okay, well, nice to see everybody. Now, first of all, I have to start with an apology from Keith Flanagan. This was going to be a double act. Keith is very much in demand as a leadership consultant, and he was offered 2 weeks leadership training, a job to do 2 weeks leadership training in Bahrain. And sadly, he's accepted. He did talk to me about, did I mind? And I said, no, of course you've got to go and do it. But what he has done is that he's had a professional video made of some of the things that he would have said had he been here. So I'll be showing you that shortly in this talk. So in place of Keith, we've got Vanessa's going to help. Vanessa Matthews is on the committee. It's going to give me a little bit of help with running the event in terms of the discussions. And being this is about soft skills, I want to make it, it's not just going to be about me standing up and talking to you about things. It's going to be an interactive, participatory type of event. And so you're going to sit and talk to each other about things, and hopefully we can have a bit of it'll be very sort of participatory. So that's what I'm hoping for, and hopefully that's what you've come to expect. Yes? Good. So this is the questions that I'm posing. First of all, I guess the fact that you're here means that you all think that soft skills are important. Yes? Anybody not think soft skills are important? Good. And really, do enterprise architecture teams give enough attention to improving them? So we'll talk about that, then we'll talk about what exactly soft skills are, and what are the most critical ones for enterprise architects. And then I'll give you some of the ideas that I've got on how we could be more effective in developing those skills in our architecture teams. I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I've been in enterprise architecture in one form or another for something like 23 years. It's quite a long time. I had about 10 years in what was business systems architecture group at British Airways. And we did we were working on processes, data and applications integration, so it was very sort of business facing, very much integrating across different domains. And we did a lot of very good work there, but it didn't always go smoothly. And I was talking to a project manager about a meeting that I was going to have with his boss. And this is what he said to me. He said, when you talk to my boss, please try to avoid your usual mumbo-jumbo. So that was a bit of an eye-opener. I thought, I'd better start working on my mumbo-jumbo filter. And I've always been very conscious since then of trying to make our communication very easy to understand and very accessible. In 2002, I left and I became an enterprise architecture consultant, and I went and worked with a lot of large organisations. And some of the work I did was to do with helping them develop the competency of their architecture teams. So I developed some competency models there. And I've drawn on that for the work that I'm presenting today. I also did quite a bit of work on architecture frameworks. Got to know John Zachman quite well. And I discovered that where people were putting too much emphasis on the framework and not enough on the use of the framework and the socialisation of the framework, that wasn't very successful. And then I became the chair of the IRM EA conference, the one that Lorne is interviewing John at next month. And I started reviewing abstracts for that. And I think there's people in the room who have spoken at that event. And I noticed that I get about 100 abstracts to read, and often they were long and rambling. It wasn't clear what the audience was going to get out of it. And I would end up helping, if I thought this person had something useful to say, I would end up helping them improve their abstract, or maybe it just didn't get picked. And I thought to myself, why are enterprise architects not better at communicating? You know, they need to sell themselves to speak at the conference, and they need to be able to say what it is that the audience is going to get out of it, and indeed what the conference people are going to get out of it. So it struck me that people weren't always good at putting themselves in other people's shoes when they were doing this. So I felt that there was definitely a lack there. And some of these were very smart people, and you meet them, they came and spoke. So I started to get this sense that there's a big gap between, in communication skills and other soft skills, between what's needed from enterprise architects and what we actually provide. So, in summary, I think soft skills are a critical success factor for architecture, whether it's enterprise architecture or solutions architecture. Because essentially, it's a socio-technical activity. It requires a lot of in-depth analytical cognitive skills, but it also requires us to be able to work with people from different domains across boundaries. And that means we've got to be very thoughtful about how we communicate and how we work with them. And also, we have to work with the politics of the situation, because we're often trying to create change which is somewhat at odds with the value systems of people. People are used to doing whatever they want to do, and you're trying to get them to be more corporate, then that's actually quite challenging. Now, has anybody been to the Gartner conference today? Yeah, all right. I was eavesdropping on it through Twitter, and I noticed somebody tweeted a nice comment, which was that enterprise architects must produce signature-ready recommendations in a language executives understand. So, I don't know who said that, but I thought this guy here is obviously looking for a signature-ready recommendation. You can see he doesn't look as though he's got it yet, but sorry,
it's just skipped a few.
So, now talking of Gartner, back in 2009, they published, before their 2009 conference, they published a PR release, and it consisted of 10 architecture pitfalls, really. And if you look at them, 7 out of those 10 are related to soft skills. So about the head of enterprise architecture not being able to get enough influence, insufficient stakeholder understanding, not engaging business people. So that was 6 years ago. Do people think that we've got better since then? Do you think we have? I see people shaking their heads. It's a shame. So let's now listen to Keith, because I've only met Keith fairly recently, but we've discovered that we've got a lot in common in terms of we're both very interested in the softer side or communication side of enterprise architecture. And he's actually comes from an HR background, so he's a leadership consultant in a more general sense. And he was going to come and, as I say, help with this presentation. But I've got a video now where he's going to talk about what his experience of actually training people in soft skills, because he's delivered an awful lot of soft skills training all over the world. So just hang on a moment.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So I just need to understand line 6. What were they filling out there? What were they trying to
Oh, the EA group does most of the architecting. Well, what they think is that you should create virtual teams to do architecting. You shouldn't have a huge EA central group, that you have a small, very focused EA group who pulls in the expertise. And that way you get more diverse perspectives on what you're doing. This is about 5 minutes long.
I'm Keith Flanagan, and I've been working closely with enterprise architects and technologists since 2010. During this time, I've helped thousands of professionals from all over the world to understand the value and benefits of soft skills development. Given that a significant part of a senior architect's or IT manager's day is routinely spent dealing with people, there's a clear requirement that behavioural competencies form a hugely important part of their success. And although opinion to support this has more recently been generally accepted, I'm often still quite surprised that so little investment is being made to develop many of our professionals in these critical areas. Because in organisations where investment in training, coaching, profiling and team development is being made, architects and technologists are reaping the rewards through the creation of stronger engagement with their teams and with their stakeholders, many of whom are relied upon to sponsor and support their projects. I believe that one reason for this reluctance to embrace the importance of soft skills is that the world of technology, be it IT or architecture, is largely dominated by men. When I launched the developmental program for technologists with the words soft skills in the title, it attracted some peripheral interest, but little in the way of commitment through sign-up. Whereas, when the term soft skills was removed, the program gained a lot more traction with male technologists, despite the contents of the program remaining largely unchanged. It's probable then that the male perception of the term soft skills, when seen as a set of intangible behavioural competencies, may have their benefits. The label soft skills may not be quite as palatable, especially for technologists. Another aspect to this theory is the subject of personality or psychometric profiling. Many technologists have told me that they are dismissive, if not uncomfortable, with any form of profiling, as they view it as being too subjective or even fluffy. I believe there are two possible reasons why a technologist may hold this opinion. The first is that many traditional technologists have prepared to concentrate on hard facts, science and evidence, that profiling without consideration of every single detail or variable can never be truly accurate and probably should be dismissed. Second, and perhaps more sadly, is that many of the clients that I have worked with who had been exposed to profiling had either a bad experience due to the poor standards of the profiling practitioner, or that once profiling had taken place, the results were never used for any sustained developmental gain. However, for me, as a leadership consultant, the question arises: how can anyone really know how they are perceived by others without some form of proven insight into their own behavioural characteristics? This doesn't necessarily advocate all forms of psychometric profiling. Rather, the appropriate form of profiling carried out by an appropriate practitioner, with the outcomes being put to good use. Whatever label you wish to use, the development of soft skills in many of the professionals that I have worked with has been of tremendous benefit. In Eastern Europe, for example, a practice of architects were continually fighting through barriers with governmental departments due to the somewhat bureaucratic nature of the organisational culture. However, following the continued use of soft skills developed by undertaking a program designed specifically for technologists, many reported breaking new ground with their previously resistant stakeholders and secured an appetite for buy-in to architecture projects that had never existed before. Many of the architecture teams found themselves in positions of much greater influence at senior levels through the open use of skills such as empathy, collaboration, change leadership, and communication. Ultimately, this particular architecture practice became a high-performing and cohesive team that was widely regarded as a much-valued asset, as opposed to being looked upon as a group of technologists with only their own interests at heart. Similar results were witnessed within the public and private organisations in the US, Canada, New Zealand and the UK. Technology teams and architecture practices that had adopted the use of soft skills were seeing very real benefits by changing their approach to stakeholders at all levels across the business. Also interesting was that many had reported they were enjoying much more personal satisfaction from their work, and that their working environments had changed for the better, due to a greater focus on workplace empathy. Many said that they felt better supported by their managers to provide a great service. In essence, we were helping to create great places to work, which would result in lower staff turnover, less sickness absence, and higher levels of morale, all leading to great performance. Greater engagement at all levels of stakeholder meant that key figures were buying into the value of architecture and technology because they had an emotional stake in the process. I don't believe that anybody goes to work to do a bad job, but I do believe that soft skills not only create great technologists and architects, they also produce great leaders and role models. Now, which one of us doesn't want to be one of those?
interesting, wasn't it? That when I was talking to Keith, I was quite surprised that he said that when he was running courses on soft skills, but they had to rebrand them to actually get people to really increase the take-up to a greater level. Actually, the name was putting people off, and we were wondering whether actually we'd chosen the right name for this talk. Maybe that's that. But it is interesting that it's a good label for the sort of things we're going to talk about. But it might actually put people off. Is that your experience? Do people find that it's fluffy stuff and people think it's not worth spending time on because it's too fluffy?
Well, soft and fluffy go together, don't they?
But fluffy being a negative thing and hard being a positive thing.
Yeah.
Hard-nosed is...
If it's any comfort to you, the project management specialist group does acres and acres of soft skills work. So there is value in it, we perceive.
What did he rebrand it as in the end?
It was called Elevating Enterprise Architecture.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, the other good bit of that story, I think, is the way that he talked about that they've been able to actually transform the performance of an architecture group, and it's quite an inspiring story that had actually worked well when they really had invested in it. Okay, let's go back to what's happened to my presentation.
His website's not kfc.co.uk, is it?
No. I lost my presentation. Sorry. Back to that. Okay, so now, why is that? Now, it turns out, and I've only discovered this quite recently, that there's some research that explains why there's this kind of lack of interest or lack of enthusiasm for soft skills, which is to do with the way that our brains are wired. Does anybody recognise this chap? Anybody recognise who this is? His name is Simon Baron-Cohen. He's the cousin of Sacha Baron-Cohen. And he's actually an expert on autism. But he's done... I'm not implying that we're all autistic, because we're architects. But sort of related to that is that he wrote a book in 2003, it's quite a while ago, called The Essential Difference. It's about the difference between... there's a strong gender difference between men and women. And there's also a preference in people's brains between being systemizers, people who like to analyse and organise things, and empathisers who are more concerned with understanding people, and they're quite negatively correlated. But there are people who are good at both. Some people, it says systematising, empathising are equally strong. He calls that the balanced brain. Now I've put some references at the end of this talk, and there's a reference to an article he wrote in The Guardian. But I thought it was quite interesting because I've often wondered why there are so few women architects and in general so few women in IT. I know it's partly cultural, but it does seem to be very unbalanced, and this suggests a reason for it. Now you can do a test online. I've done the test. I come out actually slightly more on empathising than systematising, but it's not a big difference. So that kind of shows that there's if you like, a natural reason for this phenomenon. So, having talked about why they're important and why we might not be doing them very much, let's just go on to what they really are and how we might improve on them. So what I mean by soft skills is, and this is fairly consistent with HR practice. If you go on the CIPD website and look, they talk about, I think they talk about technical skills actually, or functional skills, but functional or technical skills are the skills you need to basically do your job. So it's more about what you do in your job. Project management would be a functional skill. Or the skills that go with project management. They are more specific and more concrete, and you can recruit for them and test for them. The soft skills are more about the how you go about your job. They're more subjective. And a lot of them, most of them are to do with relationships with people. So how you communicate with people, how you respond to people. But I also think that there are some cognitive skills that fit in that space as well. And I will go on and elaborate on that a little bit later. And if you look at, I imagine a lot of you either have organisational skills frameworks, you've got corporate ones, or you use Sophia or the TOGAF skills. How many people actually are working within the context of a competency framework?
Several.
It's not many. Oh, interesting. I thought there would be more. Okay. Certainly, when I was at British Airways, we had a management framework which we were working within, and then we had technical overlays on that. If you are trying to do some work in this area, and you might well start with Sophia or TOGAF or one of those, Cozy, another one. I've found when I've looked at these, they tend to really just list the skills. They don't really describe them in a way that you could actually manage somebody with them, or develop them, or you could self-develop. They're really just a list of skills, and they don't give you the information that you need to really create competence. How do you recognise real competence, that somebody's competent to do the job rather than they've been on a course? So what we found when I did these projects with my clients was that they certainly wanted to use those frameworks if they could, but they didn't find them as useful as they might have done. Now, I know that they've moved, well, certainly Sophia's moved on several generations since then, but I'm not sure that it still does what you really need. So competence is really about the way you put skills together, and competence isn't just about skills, it's about knowledge and behaviour. Competence is in a context. So you could be competent to work for a very creative firm, or you could be competent to work in a very industrialised firm. It might not be transferable across those two different contexts. On the other hand, it might be. So a competency framework is something which organises and defines the individual competencies required for an organisation or job family. That's how I'm defining a competency framework. And a job family could be architects, could be enterprise architects and project architects and whatever other sorts of architects you have. So this is the approach that I've developed. That's kind of elaborated on what I've done before, and this is, if you like, my current thinking on this, is that if you are looking at competency, there's a number of things you want to consider. First of all, you want to consider what's the demand, what is expected of this person, what are they accountable for, what are the sort of commitments they make, and what sort of stakeholders do they produce them for. So who do they have to deal with? And what's their role, what's its purpose, and how much latitude do they have? Are they the sort of people that can go around challenging people or creating new ideas, or are they there simply to do a job and do what they're told and to deliver the deliverables that they're forced to do? So there's a certain amount of contextual information there. In terms of how you actually decide whether people meet that specification, you've then got to look at the functional skills, and those are underpinned by the behavioural skills. So, because in meeting their commitments for one set of stakeholders, they're likely to be working in groups, teams, interviews with a different set of stakeholders, and they both apply their skills, but they apply it and through communicating with people. So running workshops, interviews, writing reports, all those kinds of things. So behavioural skills really underpin the functional skills. And then beneath that, I suppose that being an enterprise architect, I can't resist a layered architecture, so this is a layered architecture. So here we have a layered architecture, and beneath that is the personality traits, beliefs and values, and just like other layered architectures, the things at the bottom are the things that are most difficult to change. So the behavioural skills may be more difficult to develop. It may be difficult to change your personality traits, though not impossible, as I hope to demonstrate. And then the functional skills may come and go to some extent. So my goal in this framework is to appeal to the engineering mindset of the architect, to try and get them interested in soft skills, if you like. This is me blending my emotional side and my engineering side together. This is what I've come up with. Now, just for interest, because we haven't got time to go through this, otherwise you won't get to the end and the networking. It turns out there's loads of stuff that people need to know to do their job well, especially if they're enterprise architects, because they're working in teams, they are working for an organisation which has got its own culture, brand, business model, strategy and politics. You are in a profession, you may be in a profession which may have a code of conduct or some professional standards, and actually if you're a global organisation then you've got different things going on in different countries. So looking at trying to build an assessment framework, there's an awful lot of knowledge that you want people to have. Anyway, today we're only talking about these two things in here, so I shall move on quickly. And now let's stop and think about that now, and think about soft skills. So what I'd like you to do is get into groups of 3 or 4 and think about what you think are the most critical behavioural skills for enterprise architects. And you should all have a little card on your seat that, if you haven't sat on it. If you haven't got them to write with, there's some pencils here. So basically, get into groups of 3 or 4, then think of your top 3 soft skills, write them on a card, then share them amongst the group, and then see how similar or how different they are. Just see how long that goes for. And I thought what might be interesting was, if you hand the cards in, we can tally them up and report back as to what you thought. Okay, shall we stop now? I imagine you could probably go on for quite a while nattering about this. That's good. But since we are constrained for time, we haven't really got time to let that run on for too long. So I'm not going to go around the groups and ask you to sort of report back on everything every time. And we'll collect in the cards. But do you want to shout out any particular interesting discussions you had? Anybody want to offer anything there?
Well, my colleague here was talking about emotional intelligence, and I mentioned empathy, same similar meaning. He was basically, I mentioned collaboration, you mentioned consensus building.
Right.
Essentially the same word, essentially similar goals, if you like.
Right.
They're similar goals.
Yes, that's a good one, yeah. Any others? Leadership, you said?
Yeah, I mean, I was just like saying it in one word, right? So, I think leadership's an important, particularly when you've got a group of people trying to build a consensus.
Yeah.
It can be quite hard.
Yes.
Unless there is leadership, unless there's leadership to get you, sort of herding everyone in.
Somebody that's making you converge.
Exactly,
Yeah.
converge on a principle.
Yeah. Right.
I tried softer skills. So listening, reflecting and empathising.
Right, good, yeah.
Which is at the heart of elicitation.
Yes.
And getting correct information as well.
Yep, good, yeah. Any others?
In our group, persuasion and negotiation actually came out as general communication skills.
Right. Well, that's an excellent set, I think. Do you want to hand over the sheets now?
Yeah, sure.
And I'll collect in the cards. Yes.
Yeah.
thanks for that. So, in the work I've done with clients, I've kind of reorganised it a bit since then, sort of tried to generalise it a bit. There seem to be these five, in terms of soft skills, there seem to be 5 themes, and they're not, you can't really, they're not mutually exhaustive, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. They overlap, but so that's why I've got the Venn diagram with the 5 circles. But basically, communication. The things that my clients were saying is that the real challenge for architects is the sheer number of different sorts of people they have to communicate with in different sorts of ways. So from very high-level executives down to quite technical people, and that's very challenging. Change leadership, you had that. This is about influencing without authority. Management leadership is rather different if you sort of look at the management literature on leadership. For architects it's a little bit different because we're trying to lead from the side, and that provides some challenges. The world is changing so fast, we've got to be continuously learning, and things like reflection, what have I learnt, how can I use it? Taking on new ideas and knowledge, helping others to learn, so that a whole learning thing and having a culture of learning. The one that's often missing from soft skills is thinking. That's tended to be seen as a harder skill. The reason I put it here is because, again, you've got to be able to change your mode of thinking according to the context. It's not purely about analytically thinking yourself in a straight line from A to B. Or maybe it is sometimes. Maybe you do have to think yourself from A to B. But knowing when you want to think your way from A to B and when you want to sort of wallow in a mess for a while to find out the best way of getting out of it, that's a real skill, I think, to be able to actually have different approaches.
Would you say flexible thinking the same as empathy, emotional intelligence?
No, that's down in the next layer down, if you like. That's in the yellow bit. We'll come on to that. But you need it. In a way, they're all needed for this. They support this. And then the collaboration is about being able to work in the right kind of context. Are you on a project team, in which case it's a bit more straightforward because you've got a shared set of goals? Or are you bringing a load of people together to look at an issue when they don't really want to be there? I did a lot of this at BA, actually, where we would be aware of a problem that was bubbling up, and we'd have to get people to turn up to a meeting to decide whether there was a problem and how we might resolve it. And then sometimes, when people didn't want you to solve the problem, you got hate mail afterwards. So that brings a whole bunch of skills about how you do that, and whether you do it in a way that makes people hate you. Actually, it wasn't my fault that I got hate. So that's, if you like, the areas, and then drilling down. So what we actually have is the competencies themselves, which you can see on the diagram there in the middle of the circle. There are more detailed things, and Terry, you mentioned dialogue, didn't you? Did you mention dialogue? No. Empathy. Oh, no.
Empathy, yes.
Yeah, that's coming. Yes, reflection. Yeah, but the communication side of things, it's amazing how many competency models you look at. There's another mention of listening. So dialogue, being able to listen to people as well as talk to them. Information seeking. A whole bunch of different sorts of communication, not just blasting stuff out of people, selling your architecture to them, but actually working with them. Now, a lot of these are activities, so they're kind of activity based. Some of them are more mindset based, so action orientation, not wanting to sit and analyse something to death before you make a decision. Sense making, knowing, when, as I say, when to sort of take time to think about something, or whether to sort of scoot on and do something very quickly. Creativity is both a process and a mindset. So these tend to have an activity element to them, how do you do the activity. There's also a mindset element to them. How do you respond, and how do you think about it? So mindset comes across all of this, really. So that's really, these are what I consider to be, based on my work I've done, empirical work, considered to be the core competencies. It'd be interesting to see if people have identified anything else, and we'll feed that back. In terms of how you actually, given that these are quite squishy, how do you develop them? Well, one first step is to actually describe them. So what we did was we would come up with a description. So this is something called communications planning. So this is saying that when you're communicating with people, you've got to decide how you want to communicate. Before you go off and produce presentations or write reports, you've got to decide what kind of communication you're doing, whether a presentation or a report or a workshop is the right thing. So the competency is about structuring and targeting communications with different stakeholder groups. And then we listed behaviours. So what are these are the behaviours that somebody who's good at this does well. And some of them, you might find these in any management competency framework, but there are some that are perhaps particularly relevant to architecture. So this one here that says applies metaphors intelligently to get new ideas across. That's actually quite an important idea for architects, because you can communicate your new paradigm using a metaphor. Picking the right metaphor, that's a very specific skill. So these, in general, this is my generic set, but I think an organisation might want to target them a bit more precisely. And then anti-behaviours. Sometimes these can be more revealing than the behaviours. So what do people who are really bad at this do? And then you can use this as a development tool, or you can use it as an assessment tool. So people who are high performers do most of the behaviours and don't do the anti-behaviours. Or you can do it to some extent as a recruiting tool as well. So the first step really is describing, and this is what you don't get in things in these industry standard frameworks typically, unless anybody can correct me. If you want a framework like this, if you want to see a framework like this, civil service has got one. The management framework for the civil service. If you Google that, you'll see there's a whole bunch of stuff. It's levelled, so which I think I'm not keen on levelling soft skills, because why shouldn't an ERC aspire to be very good at doing all of these things? I mean, why would you limit them by saying, oh, you're only a level 3 person, you don't need to do some of those? So, but the civil service one is very much like that. I think it's got behaviours and anti-behaviours. It's quite rich. The other thing that we did was to collect tools. So as well as actually describing it, to create a kind of inventory of things you could use to do things. Now this is quite a well-known way of thinking about consultation and management and visioning. It comes from Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline Field Book. It says that if you are trying to make change happen, you can decide what the change is going to be and tell people, in which case they won't have participated very much in that. But then they might not agree with it either. So the more participation you get, the more you're going to get agreement, but the more work you're going to have to put into to do it. So it starts with telling, and it goes to selling. And we will try and persuade you it's a good idea. And then this is where you're looking for some feedback, and so you're going to refine it. This is where you consult people before you do it, so get their views. And then co-creating is where you've got a very participatory process, where you've got large numbers of people actually involved in it. And I haven't really come to talk about that. That's just an example of a tool that you can have in your toolkit, which helps you to plan your communications. So this is just an example.
So would this signature ready recommendation for executive would come with heading, right? Here is the answer.
I'm sorry?
Signature ready recommendation for the executive, would it not come to here is the answer?
Oh, I see. Yes, signature ready. Yes, yes, that would be yeah. Good point. Yes, yes, a signature ready thing. Yes. Yeah, I wondered about that too. Actually, you might at least do a bit of selling, mightn't you? Okay, so that was the green level bit. So in the layered architecture, we've been talking about the green level, the behavioural competencies. Now let's look at the personality traits. And emotional intelligence is interesting. I haven't put emotional intelligence here explicitly, but they're kind of different viewpoints on a similar thing. I think that for those of you who are not familiar with emotional intelligence in depth, there's about 5 elements to it. It was derived as a set of behaviours by high-performing managers, I think in the early 90s, and it was then popularised by a chap called Daniel Goleman, who popularised the term emotional intelligence and wrote a lot of books on it. And he's still writing books about it, and that's how I got to the Simon Barron stuff through him. And emotional intelligence is about is empathy, self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, and socialisation. It turns out to be quite highly correlated with some personality traits. So I'm not sure if it's part of personality or whether it's something a bit different. It's probably not a topic for now. But I'll talk here about personality because it's the personality profiling tool that's really useful here. So personality is a recognition of the fact that we're all different. Hoping somebody would say, oh no, we're not. Okay, so we agree we're all different, and personality is a way of representing that. So it's a set of observable factors, and the exact factors depend on the model. And then it affects your behaviour, so it affects how you respond to people, how you process information, how you make decisions, what you do when there's an argument, do you run away or do you stand up to them, and how you deal with stress. So it's a way of, if you like, exposing all those things that are quite difficult to talk about and putting it into a framework that allows you to talk about it. Now I imagine a lot of you, most of you, have you? Is there anybody here who hasn't done a personality test?
Yes, not that.
Sorry?
What's the question?
Have you done one of these personality profiles like Myers-Briggs or something? I shouldn't call them tests because it's not a test, it's a profile. And different people have got different views as to how valuable they are. But in British Airways we had one. We found it really valuable to basically understand mysteries. Why is this person so difficult for me to deal with? It kind of unlocks some of those mysteries. But it also gives you a language to talk about behaviour which you wouldn't otherwise have. And it stops you from having to upset people when you want to suggest that they could be helpful if they changed their behaviour a bit.
Be reasonable to that.
So in this sense, you can look at those behavioural competencies and see how these personality traits could affect them. Now, so there are lots of models. The Myers-Briggs, the MBTI is a very well-known one. There's also one called the Big Five, and there's various proprietary ones. Now, this is a proprietary one that I've been using because I know the chap who designed it, so declaration of interest. I haven't got a financial interest in it, but I quite like it. But it's really good to make the point. So just treat this as an illustration of how you can use these tools. And this happens to be a very rich one, and it's quite scientifically rigorous as well. So it's basically, you do a questionnaire and you end up with a report which gives you a number of views of your personality. And they come at different levels. The diagram is called a splash, and everybody's splash is different. And the splash is really representing how you relate to these things around the edge. And they are things like people-focused, inspiration-driven, big-picture thinking, extroverted, outcome-focused, discipline-driven, down-to-earth. Those are called aspects. That's the middle level. There's a higher level, which is colours, which is just 4 things, which is very easy to work with. And then there's a much more detailed level, which is the things around the outside. And there's 24 qualities. And so that makes it much richer and much more unique and easy to work with. And it also solves a few mysteries in its own right as well, because the way these are organised is that the most highly correlated ones in the population at large are closest together. So down here, people who are reliable are often very structured. So reliable means that you will deliver it when you say you're going to deliver, and often people achieve that by being very structured. Purposeful means that I'm going over there, that's where I'm going, I'm not going to deviate. Logical means that you're very rational in how you make decisions, as opposed to being empathetic over here. Comes back to Mr. Baron Cohen's theory again. You've got empathy over here, logical here. And I've done a few enterprise architects, some of them are in the room, and noticed a few patterns, but there's a big spread. It's not, we don't all follow the same pattern at all. They tend to be high on conceptual, as you might expect. And another interesting thing I've noticed, which might puzzle people, is that they tend to be high on logical, but low on structured. Which is surprising sometimes. Surprises some people. You think architects would be structured. Turns out we're not very structured. We don't actually, although we want everybody else to follow processes, we don't seem to want to follow them ourselves. So you get interesting insights coming out of this stuff.
Does that mean they're not reliable?
Some of them are, yes. And let's move on quickly because we're going to...
It's not that they're not reliable, they're flexible.
Flexible, yes. Okay, so this is the 4-colour model. The colours are relatively intuitive, so and we'll stick to this one for now, because otherwise we will run out of time. So green is the collaborative, empathetic, people-focused colour. Yellow is more the kind of imaginative, radical, creative colour. Red is the let's very very directive, takes charge of things, very very purposeful. And then blue is more down to earth, wants practical evidence. That would be more your kind of bog standard IT developer, whereas your architect would be more likely to be up here, perhaps generally. I'll quickly move on. So in more detail, these are the 24 things. Now, what you can do is you put these two things together, and you can see how the personality model, just at the 4-colour level, you could apply that to a lot of these things. So just designing communications, if you're trying to get somebody to change or shift them in a certain direction, it helps to understand, be able to read their personality, understand your own personality and how best to relate to them. Learning, you can use this to, if you do the full thing, it will make you much more self-aware. And you can use it for coaching and feedback. Flexible thinking, you can use this and say, well, let's think, how would a person with a lot of red energy do this? How would a person with a lot of yellow energy do it? Apply different styles of thinking. And then you can see there's obvious applications in collaboration, in designing workshops to appeal to all the different sorts of people, or perhaps to the sort of people that you've got in the workshop. So a couple of quick examples. So this is a detailed page from the report. I think it's me. I think this is me. See, I'm very conceptual and collaborative. So I'm quite strong on the green and yellow colours. But showing somebody that, you can see what things they're most comfortable with and what things they're least comfortable with, and you can work on some of the, you work on the gap between what they do, what they are, and what they do. This one is quite useful. So going back to communications planning thing I was showing you earlier, if you think about if you think about you're going to give a presentation, you might try and design that presentation to appeal to all different colours, because you don't know who's in the room. On the other hand, you might say, well, actually, I know that all these people will be predominantly of one colour, and you can kind of orientate your presentation to meet those objectives. And if you are, so if we work our way around those 4 colours, if somebody's a predominantly got a lot of green in their personality, I'm trying very hard not to say they're green people, because that would be labelling them. We don't like doing that. If you've got a lot of green in their personality, they're going to be very interested in the impact of a change on people and who's involved in it and who's supporting it, who's against it. If they're very yellow, then they are more interested in what's the big idea, and is it, lie like it. If you're very red, they'll be very hard-nosed and say what's the business benefits and what's going to happen when and what we're going to do, and they'll be quite kind of, they won't want a lot of information, they want very concise information, unlike people who are down to earth and the detailed people who will want a lot of information about what it actually looks like and what are the risks and does it fit, and they want a lot more stuff. I've noticed that sitting in conference presentations, sometimes you can tell the personality of the person from the nature of the presentation. It's quite interesting. And if you're giving a conference keynote, you don't really want it to be deep blue, because it will simply send everyone to sleep. You want lots of yellow and a bit of red and a bit of green to get people excited. So you want to go around those 3 colours. So it's quite a useful way of thinking. Okay. Right, time for discussion 2. We're okay, we're on track. So, get in your groups again. I want you to think. I said to think of the 3 best architects you've known. Or you can think of the worst architects you've known, if you like. It's up to you. But what were their most striking characteristics? And were these characteristics functional or behavioural? So, how does this kind of model help you assess people, and does it actually bring out any insights into how really good architects perform? So, think, share, discuss. So think about 3 architects, share them with your group, discuss their characteristics, see whether this is useful. Good.
Do you want people to write this down?
No, I wasn't going to get people to write it down. It's probably, well, I mean, it could be libelous. It could be libelous, couldn't it? Right. How was that? Was that an interesting discussion? Are there lots of great architects out there that we can learn from?
We're all here.
We're all here, all in the room. Oh, terrific. So, anybody got any observations on what we're talking about in terms of... Well, first of all, did you decide your great architects were largely functionally great or behaviourally great, or were they a combination of the 2? So it was the way they blended the 2 things together that made them great.
I think the 2 together give you a level of credibility that makes that person likeable.
Right.
That pushes them into a leadership category. Because if you've got the knowledge and you're credible and you can exercise it well, you're falling in that leadership category that actually, if you're able to bring an audience along with you, then actually you've won half the battle.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So it is a blend of the 2 things, and the way you bring, the way you're able to orchestrate your skills in relation to other people is very important. Anything else?
On the behavioural side, one of the things was leadership, innovation and vision are the key things which we came up with few names. I think those 3 traits were common in all 3 of them.
Okay. Leadership, innovation and vision. Right. Okay. That's good. Yes, that sounds like a good trio. Anything else?
I heard a definition of diplomacy one time, which seems to fit here. And that's the art of letting people have your way.
Yes, write that down. Yes. nearly there for the refreshments and questions. And I just wanted to draw it all together. So what I'm trying to give you is a sort of framework for thinking about soft skills. In practice, if you wanted to go back and do this at home, or at work, I mean, then what we found worked was basically trying to come up with a picture of competence and a toolkit. But not to go mad on sort of lots of training. This isn't something you need to sort of spend a fortune on. You can actually do this at quite low cost. Produce a framework and then leave people to work with it on their own, or get people to collaborate on producing the framework. But the important thing is what we call blended learning strategies. That's a buzzword in the HR world, blended learning. I think it's designed to promote more e-learning. I think that's what the point of it is. But I think it's a useful concept if you ignore that bit of it and just say it's learning through different ways of working. So this is these are the kinds of different things you can do, and we also, as part of the framework, we define things called work-based learning activities, which would be things that people could do to increase their skills. So an example of one would be give a presentation on a technical topic to a business audience, and give a presentation on a business topic to a technical audience. So those little things that you could be doing as part of your day job. Communities of practice, obviously quite widespread, but that requires somebody with real passion and enthusiasm to drive it. And then action learning sets is a group of people who make a commitment to meet regularly, and they make a commitment to do something, and then they report back to the group next time they meet. So it's a kind of structured team learning. So those are the sorts of things you can do to make this happen. Once you've got a clear description, it becomes a lot easier. I think that's, all we've got now is a summary. So soft skills are very important. I've talked about the distinction between functional skills and behavioural skills, and it might be better to talk about behavioural skills rather than soft skills, because that doesn't sound so squishy. It's a new word. I talked about the difference between skills and competence, why a skills framework isn't really enough. We talked about the 5 areas, which seem to correlate pretty well with what you came up with, so it's no surprise there. And something like the Lumina Spark portrait or a similar tool can actually bring some insights and help you develop those soft skills. So that is, I think, the end. There's some references. You'll obviously be able to access this presentation on the website, so some references there. And that's us. Keith is here virtually and would like to be here. So that's the end. Have you got any questions before we rush out?
Do you think that personality profile that you can work out through tests, is it fixed for a person, or do you think a person can change, can go from blue to red,
There's one thing I didn't really have time to talk about, but no, it isn't fixed, I don't think. The Lumina model has 3 sorts of, the test breaks down into 3 personas, what they call personas. One is your underlying persona, which is the deep you, which is probably more difficult to change. And then they have a thing called your everyday persona, which is the way you adapt your behaviour to your environment. And then they have the overextended persona, which is what you're like under stress. That's a unique feature of that particular system, that they have those 3 different personas. It's quite useful. It's really interesting when you do the test, and I can show you this if you're interested, that to compare the 3, and you can see where people flip and they change between home and work. And that, if you're doing a lot of change to fit in, it can be quite exhausting. On the other hand, you could have hidden talents that you're not using. So it's quite an interesting way of looking at it. So yeah, that's true. Things can change. Any more?
So when students do Lumina Spark personality test, do you always specify the context that you're talking about? Because you probably agree people do have different personalities in different contexts.
Well, the questions are rather orientated towards the work environment.
Okay.
So, whereas some of them are more kind of, some of them are a bit more oblique. They ask you, would you rather read poetry or go to a party or something like that, which is a bit more, which is not work related. This one is quite work related. But the way that the questions are framed, the answers you give will flesh out the underlying you, which might be more likely to be the you at home.
Does it always find that people are in those blocks of colours? Because a bit like you were saying, a lot of BAs might have one quality from the red and one quality from the green.
Well,
how does it cater for someone that say is totally balanced?
Yes, people can be
colour,
totally balanced
yeah.
across the four things, or they could be more into the Zentic. There's no, there's all sorts. I've seen all sorts of weird, wonderful things, and nothing's. It's all good, because the words are chosen to be not pejorative. Whereas the Big Five has got things like conscientious and not conscientious. And who wants to not be conscientious? Well, I don't know. So, and it's got a trait called a neuroticism, which isn't particularly. I don't think that's particularly helpful. Anyone?
Perhaps more of an observation, but action learning groups, often where one person feels that they could improve in a particular area, they're not in isolation when they talk to their colleagues.
Right.
And when people do get together, they can strive and make inroads. What's your thoughts and experiences on that?
Yes, I mean, I think action learning is actually quite under. It's not particularly widely known, is it?
No, we did it in my organisation. I have to say it sounded rather up in the air when we first started, but it was actually quite good practically.
Yes, because it is that kind of commitment to meeting as a group, which means that you can say it becomes a very safe place to you can have conversations that you couldn't have anywhere else. I think that's how people describe it.
Is it the same as a broad definition?
I'm not sure, but I'm not sure of that definition. But really, when people are working together on similar things and they do have similar issues, then they can also agree, with some relevant background and context, and say, "Oh, I would like to work on this area." Get suggestions from the group. Agree, and like Sally says, check up on each other and support each other.
I believe that there's like anything that's been invented by somebody, it's kind of travelled and got walked along the way. And I believe that the original Revens, who invented it, saw it very much as a tool for the organisation, that the organisation would benefit from these people because it would create connections. So there's an element of not just personal development, but organisational development as well. Okay, I think that sounds like we're drying up the questions, but obviously I'm going to be here until...
Sachin's got a wee present.
So I would like to thank Sally for the excellent presentation. I think the session was very useful and the breakouts were all very interesting. Actually, I enjoyed it. And thanks, Sally, again for the patience in answering all my queries before the event.
Oh, it's very pleasant working with you.
So patience was not mentioned into any of those areas, but Sally showed that kind of skill. So thank you very much. And there are some sandwiches outside. And I would also encourage you to take the BCS membership. Encourage your friends, colleagues, because all these slides will be available on the secure members area. We'll be uploading the video this time as well, but it will take approximately 1 week before this slide. Thanks for listening.
And thank you, Sachin and Vanessa and Ivan and all the helpers to make these events happen.
Yes, thank you.
If you want to volunteer yourselves, please let us know. Great. Thank you, Sachin.